All right. So for this week's With Your Mind in Mind, we have Miss Rachel Fox. I'm super excited to find out more about you and your poetry and your meditation practice. Thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of this show. And so let's start off with you telling us a little bit about you and what you do.
My name is Rachel Fox, and it's a pleasure to be here, Sherry. Thank you so much for having me. I am a Dallas bred poet and meditation guide, as well as a former entrepreneur. And I am really, really focused at this point on poetry, writing, and sharing, and really just encouraging the Dallas creative community to recognize itself and its poetic potential.
I love that. Our poetic potential. I love that. I don't know if I told you that I used to write poetry a long time ago. Did we talk about that?
So briefly, but I loved it when you said it.
It was so long ago, I think I've forgotten almost, but that was probably my first comfortable position in front of people. I would write poetry and perform it back so long ago when we referred to it as spoken word. And, there were little events and people would snap their fingers, right? That was a long So, well, thank you. Thank you for being on the show with us today. So, let's talk a little bit more about poetry. So, right now is tough for everyone. We're all struggling with this pandemic and sheltering in place. Tell us a little bit about how poetry is helping you throughout this difficult time.
I feel like I love both poetry and meditation because they're so expansive in their presentation, in their reach, and in their definition, just period.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, poetry is any free form expression in one's own voice. So I feel like one can create poetry with words, whether those be written or spoken, that one can create poetry with music and be a poet who speaks in that way. One can create poetry through movement and through the body. And I feel like the magic of poetry is the self-expression, right? The ability to express oneself and to convey those sensations that are before and beyond the method of performance or the writing itself. So it's a cathartic thing, right? Poetry helps us to make ourselves known, not just to each other, but honestly to ourselves.
That's important, especially so that let's talk about that. So I think it would probably be awesome if I could write a poem to myself right now. And I don't know that I would like what I said. So that's very interesting. I don't know that we are doing as much self reflection or what is it called when it's just the introspection, right? Because there's so many negative things hitting us from the outside that it's almost difficult to want to have that conversation with ourselves, whether it's through poetry or meditation. There's just so much noise. Very difficult to find that place of mindfulness.
And I think you've just identified something that is the very first step to any poetry practice, any meditation practice, any creative practice. And that is just, we have to make time before we can make art, right? And we love to consume each other's work, right? So we're taking in media, we're taking in, other people's ideas, words, images.
Right.
And unless we create a space in which we cease doing that and we stop taking in and then express outward, that's not necessarily a natural thing to have in this day and age when we've got these little pocket computers. We've got so many devices with us at all times that it's hard sometimes to realize we haven't stopped and made room for that reflection, like you said. And I love as well that you mentioned, you're not quite sure what would come out. And that to me is the brilliance of poetry, that, expression itself is a lesson best learned by the author, or by the person who is expressing. And that to me is what separates, I would say, work from art. I mean, we don't have to separate those can be one and the same. But when it's something that's intrinsically valuable to you, or when it's something that's intrinsically satisfying, and that you're doing it for the love of the expression or for the awareness, for the realization, for the creative process in and of itself, when that is the end, right? That is so satisfying. It's so exciting to see what comes out, especially, if it's something surprising. You can learn so much from that.
That's a good point. I think I know a couple of weeks ago on my Instagram Live, we talked specifically about managing the influx of negative, how much negative information we're consuming. And so back to your point, we do make time for consumption of others' work and their art, as well as news and media and things that could be less than positive. So I like that. I like that as probably one of the key takeaways, is just make sure that we make time for that introspection, whatever that looks like, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to recognize that every human being is creative. And I think sometimes we segment ourselves into these populations of creatives and non-creatives, or artists, or, we create these labels per se. But it's like every person is creative. Every person outputs things, whether it's their food, whether it's their, written work, whether it is their dance performance. Like, everyone makes things all the time. We do.
That's awesome. That's good. So I will have to figure out what I've got to find a new way to express in 2020, because I think everyone is looking for that, that new opportunity to express themselves. And this, like I said, I thank you very much for being a part of the show. This is one of the ways that I'm working on my creativity. Now let's switch topics very briefly to talk a bit about meditation, because I'm a huge fan of meditation, a huge fan of yoga. I understand the importance of mindfulness. I will tell you that I personally am really struggling, because, my place of peace, which is now also where I work. And it's now also where my son is going to school. Like, all of the things are happening in this place that used to be my place where I can meditate. So what advice do you have for our listeners on being able to meditate in the middle of all of this kind of chaos that's happening?
So I'm going to start really simply with the very most basic definition of meditation that I usually work with. And it is the practice of returning to a point of focus of your choosing. And simply that. So we meditate more often than we think, I believe. That anytime we are at work and we're doing something and we're distracted, and then we return back to the work, that in and of itself is a meditative practice. And I feel like this happens to us all the time, especially when we're doing things that we enjoy. We call it that flow state, right? So whether it's running, you get that runner's high, or whether it's watching a film and you're so engrossed, or reading, we can really focus when we choose to. And I think that we want to, especially in this time, celebrate each time we do this, or give ourselves that recognition of that accomplishment anytime we're distracted and we find ourselves returning back. Because the fruit of meditation is that flow state, right? It's that fun, it's that joy, it's that timelessness almost. But the practice itself is the return. It is that mindful coming back. And I think that it's really, really simple to begin to incorporate. And we will all find our own preferred methods. There are so many meditation methods out there. But one of the, I guess, most basic is simply returning to your breath. And so that breath is one of the reminders, I think, that's internal, that we're always in motion, that we're always changing. You're never actually staying the same. Life in and of itself keeps continuing and is in motion. And so we can witness the rise and fall of our chest at any point, anywhere, with anyone. And we can become conscious of, one, how we're breathing. So use that breath as feedback. Is the breath long and slow? Or is it shorter, choppy, or just noticing, resisting any urge to criticize or judge yourself, but really just taking that moment to hear the body. And so you witness what's going on within the body. And then maybe you try to take that process and bring yourself some peace with it, maybe by extending, lengthening the breath, just by a little bit, a few counts on the inhalation and on the exhalation. And one of the easiest basic breath techniques that I use to stave off anxiety or to bring myself back to a place of calm is called box breath. And so that's essentially
Tell me,
4
I'm
count.
going to take notes while you're doing this because I want to make sure that I can come back to it. So it's a box breath. So tell me.
Yeah. So it is essentially you're making a square with your breath. So you're taking a breath in, and the average is about 4 counts, but whatever feels comfortable for you. So then you hold the breath at the bottom for that same amount of time. So those 4 counts. You extend the exhalation the same time, those 4 counts. And you hold at the top, those 4 counts. And then you continue along that pattern of breath, whatever length that feels comfortable for you. If you extend it longer, then perhaps it can be even more calming. But it's something that just allows you to return to an equilibrium and to witness yourself in the fullness of the breath and in the emptiness of the breath. I feel like that helps reconcile many dual things, right? Sometimes we're feeling conflicting emotions. And so to recognize that full, empty, up, down, those are essentially just opposites that define each other. So the same thing, we're joyful versus when we're sad, right? How would we know one or the other, if we didn't have them both? And so at a very physical level, it's going to calm the body down. But I think mentally as well, it gives us that pause, especially at the top and bottom of the breath. When we pause and stop breathing for just a moment,
Right.
It kind of brings us back to presence.
I love that. I think that that's probably something that I could practice doing while I'm on Zoom calls, or maybe people don't have to even know that you're doing that. I think that it's probably another misconception is that people believe you've got to have a full hour or 90 minutes to dedicate to meditation or yoga. And it's like, we don't have that. You would think we had that extra time since people are not commuting for work for the most part, but still, that 4 counts, that box breath is something we could probably just interject throughout the day at any time, right?
Definitely. It's something that I know that the military, law enforcement, many different actually, and maybe unlikely, people and organizations employ the really simple box breath just because it's so clear and concise and easy to take with you. And I think it's also nice to consider, aside from just the breath work, how it is that we as people learn when we consider how we meditate. So if we're somebody that's very visual, perhaps guided visualization would be great for us, or maybe just picking a point, to focus upon, soften our gaze. If we're someone who's auditory, maybe there's a mantra, and it can be really helpful and comfortable or comforting to repeat mantras to ourselves, especially affirmations. And that brings that intention in for us. And if we're someone who's more kinesthetic, maybe we count malas or rosaries, or we work more with the breath. So when we can kind of get a handle on how it is that we work, then it's much easier to enjoy a meditation practice that works with you, right? And not against your natural inclinations. And then we can expand from there, once we're looking for a little bit more challenge. But it's nice to have a technique that resonates personally and that sets you up for success.
I love that. I love it. I know that one of our guests from last month or the month before gave me a really good little piece of advice, a little nugget of just trying to start out the beginning of my hour each day that I'm awake. It's like just 4 minutes, right? If it's just 2 or 3 minutes or 4 minutes, to just breathe. And it's been interesting that I now know when I've not done it. I can tell that I didn't start the hour off with that intentional mindfulness. And so, again, everyone's busy. We've got things happening, but I love that you've given us a very easy way to remember the box breath. And I think, I don't know that I've ever realized that being able to bring my focus back from something is also considered meditation, because I'm not diagnosed ADD or ADHD, but I am very quick to go from one thing to the next and then that to the next. And so I love that. I love that idea of celebrating when we return back our focus. So wow, that's awesome. I'll have to make that also something that I try to incorporate. Because I don't know that I've celebrated that before. That's interesting. That's a good way of just kind of self healing, even rewarding ourselves for things that we do well. Some of us can find all the things we do wrong, and that's a good way to just kind of incorporate some positive feedback. I love that.
Well, it's human nature as well to focus on the negative, right? It helps us. It's a defense mechanism. Make sure that we stay safe by noticing, the things that are amiss or awry. But I find in that vein as well that focusing on the positive in general, or making sure to mindfully find positives as well as the clear negatives, it can be really grounding. So even just a basic, like in the morning, if those 4 minutes were you deciding what you were grateful for that day and making a list, that power of positive thinking. I know that's a cliche, but it's so true. Because if we can bring into mind all of our blessings, then those things that are our challenges seem a little bit easier to bear in mind. For
Absolutely.
sure.
Okay, well, cool. So let's talk then more about poetry. So I loved your response to poetry can be, seen as, song or dance or movement. Tell me how you are able to still find that positive, creative place, being inundated with the negativity of kind of what's happening in the world today. So how do you reframe that, or how do you take that kind of the current state of the world, which for most people is not rainbows and unicorns right now, right? So how do you do that? How do you find a place and time and mindset to become a poet in the middle of what's happening right now?
So I love this question, and it might seem counterintuitive, but I actually find myself much more prolific when I'm going through very difficult periods. That being that the imperative to create is just greater for me. I found poetry when I was very young, and it was my coping mechanism, for lack of a better set of words. And it was, to me, really empowering to take any sort of pain or negative emotion and to make it into something that I found beautiful, or make it into something that was productive, or it felt like it could share. Speaking in a voice that resonates with others, right? And I feel like if we can find the beauty in our challenge, or I think I said yesterday, the ecstasy in our ache, then we can become more satisfied with those negative emotions as we express them, right? And as we make ourselves known, then it becomes perhaps a little bit more enjoyable to be going through something. Like one of my teachers said, you can savor it or suffer it. You've got a choice.
Good. I like that.
You're allowed to enjoy anything you want. You have permission. And I was like, whoa, light bulb. I really can't enjoy anything I want. Huh. Who is to stop me from enjoying something, even if it's not supposed to be enjoyable or not traditionally enjoyable? And I feel like in this time too, humor is helpful, because levity really helps with gravity. And I used to, when I was younger, and even still now, I read a lot of Shel Silverstein, and he took me through as a child, just like so many spaces in which, if you can giggle at something, it's a little less daunting, a little bit less dark.
Agreed. I have a friend, his name is Marcus Aurelius Anderson. I will have to make sure that you two get connected.
Great name.
I know, right?
Yeah.
He wrote a book. He actually did a TED Talk, and he wrote a book about the gift of adversity. And his story is so amazing. He talks about a near-death experience and being told that he would never be able to walk again. And to see him now walking and running and kickboxing and doing all these things. But he, as a proponent of that paradigm shift, right? So if there was something that you lived through, then it's a gift because you lived through it. And there was something that you've learned from it, and you can use that going forward. So it's very, very much that same kind of perspective. Instead of saying, why me, and woe is me, and, having that kind of victim mentality, which I think is also very popular right now, sadly. It's an unfortunate truth, but he definitely flips that on its head and talks a lot about, very similarly, what you're saying, these things have happened, and I've grown as a result, or I'm better and I'm smarter and I'll be wiser going forward. So that's awesome.
I think even more than that, when we go through something or survive something, when there's a challenge that we transcend, one, you just found transcendence. So congratulations. Everybody's looking for that all the time. But two, you're distilling that experience into empathy, that then becomes so useful, and you never know when you're going to call upon it or when it's going to come into play. But there's that moment when you meet someone who's in the throes of something that you've overcome at some point, and it fills you with such a sense of purpose, just to be, a beacon of hope in some way for that person who's currently going through, or even just, how can you go down and hold a space you've never been in? Right. And so I always remind myself that whenever I'm going through something particularly difficult, that I'm sure there is going to be a future situation in which I am so glad that I have that ability to understand at one point.
No, that's good. I know that I've had the opportunity to kind of reach back and in dealing with my dad's suicide. So you and I talked about that when we chatted earlier. The fact that I never really processed most of my life, I never dealt with it. But it's interesting that, these coping mechanisms, like you mentioned earlier, the opportunity to kind of go look back and say, wow, if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been able to, for example, go speak at my son's school for career day about something as sensitive as suicide prevention and mental health awareness to a middle school, right? So I think I've had more of those opportunities to stop and look back and say, wow, if I hadn't experienced that adversity or that negativity or that trauma even, I wouldn't be able to speak the positives into the next generation or the people that are in my network or my family or my friends. So it's harder to, it's probably easier to say than do, right? Because we can say
Oh yeah.
it's probably kind of hard to put that in practice, right?
That's also where meditation to me comes into play, because returning one's focus, right? It can be from a difficult emotion to a more positive one. So from that like hopelessness to that gratitude, right? And the more and more we practice that, that return to our point of focus, the more that we're confident and not afraid that we will be unable to return from a place of emotion or suffering into a place of more ease, right? And so it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy when you're not so anxious about not being able to return back to a state that you like better than the current chaos of whatever. So when you're less afraid, it seems less chaotic even in the moment of going through suffering.
That's good. I think that's probably something we all could practice more of right now, is just, knowing that there is a purpose and being able to identify that at some point this will be a lessons learned. And so I'm in project management, and I tend to from time to time pull in project management terms. But lessons learned, I know that years ago, whenever you would finish a project, you would have a conversation afterwards, and that conversation was called like a post-mortem.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
There's just nothing positive. It just does not sound like something you want to do. No one wants to do anything post-mortem necessarily. It just has a negative connotation. So that lessons learned is probably, it's the same thing. It's the same activity, but it's just stopping to go, okay, what lessons did I learn? Who could benefit from this? And that becomes that positive, at least for me. Like, how do I take and teach others how to deal with this? And on this platform specifically, mental health and suicide prevention, I found that people who've reached out to me as a result of our work, a lot of us struggle with survivor's guilt. And so the person who's left behind after a suicide, the family that's left, the friends who are asking these questions that are self-defeating sometimes. They're just like, well, should I have known? Was there a message? Is there something that I could have done differently? And I think what you're mentioning kind of gives even that survivor's guilt an opportunity to flip it and reframe it. Like, how do I now listen for cues, and what do I need to do to be an advocate for those who are struggling? So I definitely understand how that could work.
And I think it's also important to allow ourselves to process some of our negative emotions and to know that they're okay and they're true, they're natural, right? And they are. And so just baseline, that's what's going on right now, even if we don't want to recognize negative emotions. And then allowing them to be that way. And for me, poetry and meditation, both. Meditation is the mindfulness portion. But the poetry or the creativity, the art, is about allowing yourself to express yourself, even just to see what comes out. So sometimes I'll write poetry and it'll be like, wow, that's dark. I know that I shared it with you before, but I was in an abusive marriage for a very short period of time. And it was a violent divorce, you know, assault with deadly weapons sort of a thing. And I looked back on the poetry of the previous few months prior to that. And it was clear to me, you know, that I had inklings about what was going on. I could see some of those things surface. But when the actual violent episode happened, the very, very end of that, I was much more calm because I was much less surprised, if that makes sense. Or it didn't seem completely strange, out of left field, or, you know, I had given myself permission to already be grieving what was happening. And so it seemed easier to deal with in that moment, to remain calm, knowing that, you know, negative emotions are okay to feel, especially if you're going through something really difficult.
That's good. I think, I don't know that, I'm trying to process, of course, as you speak. I've got 15 windows going right in my brain. But I think that's a challenge for me. I think that's probably been a challenge, is like even allowing the negative to exist. I probably, and my therapist says this all the time, that I am like the queen of compartmentalization. I can put it in a box and put a bow on it and just like kind of move it away somewhere and not think about it, as opposed to kind of that same, it's a different version of mindfulness. Like, yes, I am angry, or yes, I am disappointed, or I'm feeling abandoned, and putting a name to that emotion, or a name, or, you know, to, you know, bring validity to it. It doesn't mean that it has to take over my entire day, but definitely putting a word to it. Like you mentioned, again, that's not my strong suit. It's not it's not one of the things I could say I coach people on, but definitely something that I've seeing. I've heard that from several places, right? That you can allow the negative emotions to be.
And I believe something needs to be noticed before it can be released, right? If you don't know you're holding it, then how can you drop it? And one of my teachers also told me, Rachel, when you let it go, it's going to be right now. Whatever moment of now that is, it's going to be the present moment in which you let it go. And it was just another mind blow for me. It was like, oh my gosh, it will be right now. It will be. Maybe not right now, but it will be at a present moment in which I allow something to be released, or, you know, that I will let go or move on, or, you know, I will feel better at a certain present moment in time.
I love that. You just have all these golden nuggets of things that are just like dropping. It's amazing. That's really good. I like that. That probably would help a lot of us just be able to process through, like, whenever you're ready, whenever it's time for you to deal with it, will be the perfect time to deal with it. I think that probably would allow some of us that healing that we really need.
And I think it's also important on the other side too, to know that not every problem has to be solved right now. You know, your life isn't a problem to be solved per se, but that, you know, you can notice something without having to deal with it right then. Maybe right then is not the right time, but the mindfulness allows you to at least know what you're working with. You know, have a view on the territory of yourself, because nobody else, you know, a doctor will tell you the patient is the one with access to all of the information about their symptoms and about their condition. And so when the patient can accurately report what it is that's going on, it's easier to know what's going on.
Right. And then, that's a great analogy too. I think from a mental health perspective, I don't know that we see how much we own that, sadly, right? It's like we want someone else to, and your analogy is perfect, the doctor to come in and say, here's why, Sherry, you can't focus, and this is the reason, as opposed to that internal, you know what, I haven't been able to finish any of the things on my to-do list. Why? Did they all need to be done today? Probably not. Again, that's the project manager part coming out, right? I'm like, everything was due yesterday and it should have been done, you know, at this point of excellence that no one else could even really ever require. But not having to do everything at once is probably one of the positives that I think from this pandemic, because all of the things that we thought were so important that had to happen right now may not even be a thing anymore right now. Like it may not even be relevant at all. And so I definitely think it's given us a chance to step back and breathe and
Yeah.
ask.
And I think just how everybody, you know, appears differently, speaks differently, makes stuff differently, we all get through life differently. We have our own processes that work for us, and they don't have to look like any specific thing. I remember when so I'm from a military family. Both my parents, their dads, you know, most of my, like tons of uncles, you know, it's a thing.
Mhm.
And our house was very, you know, you kind of walked in lockstep. You did things A, B, C. You know, my grandfather would say, what are the 3 steps between A and B? And that's what you've got to do to get there.
Mhm.
But I'm someone who's much more dreamy. I'm much more intuitive. And it took me so long to give myself permission to be myself. And I feel like the pandemic is a great like petri dish in which we can be like, okay, let's see how we work. Given, you know, now we can maybe do little experiments, even just with our daily routines. And you can kind of see how you're impacted or affected by those rituals you begin to create. And they don't need to look like anybody else's, right? You don't need to copy someone, because everything, every book ever written, every recipe, every practice, somebody made it up.
Mm-hmm.
And we're somebody, you know, and so you are, you know, worthy of creating your own routines and ways of getting things done. I think a lot of us spend a lot of time trying to live up to something, right? Or trying to fulfill an ideal of productivity or whatnot. And it's like, you know, Sherry's version of productive, Rachel's version of productive might be completely different. They might look completely different and need to be supported by different things.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, poetry is one great way to see that, because you see people's art and you're like, okay, clearly that's their style. That's their style. You know, you can begin to tell who someone is
Mm-hmm.
by what they make. And I really wish in schools that we didn't study so much other people's work and have to analyze it, right? I wish that we could do a little bit more creative work.
Well, you know what? Now that you mention that, though, I think that this is an opportunity for that. I mean, you know, again, it's challenging to have a now 7th grader home and teaching him, you know, but it gives us the opportunity to incorporate additional learnings, right? And so, yes, here's what the curriculum is from the school district. However, let's then, you know, augment that with some poetry and some music and art. And it does give us an opportunity as parents, as educators, as leaders, even in our companies. We have a lot more time to integrate things that may not have been integrated before because we didn't have time, or it wasn't on the curriculum, or someone didn't think it was important. You make a great point. We can definitely use that as an opportunity to say, you know what, your school will be different. Now you'll have, you know, if you're going to go online and look at your homework, you can also go online and research, you know, a poet who wrote something about a time of trouble or strife, right? So maybe that's positive that has come out of the pandemic, is that we get to augment and support teaching, even in programs like this, and you being a part of this platform. I greatly appreciate you taking the time. I know you're super busy and we've missed each other a couple of times, but you said that when things happen, you just said it. You said your teacher said it's in that moment is when it was supposed to happen. So,
Yes.
I love it. So tell me, what would you love for our viewers to do? So I asked before, you know, to make sure that we've got a call to action. So people are like, okay, this is great. I love meeting Rachel. She was amazing. How do I keep in touch with her? So how do we have our viewers and listeners reach out to you? And what services do you offer?
So the next and biggest project that I have coming up is the release of my first book through Deep Vellum Books here in Dallas. And please check out Deep Vellum. I'm not just an author, I'm also an ambassador for them. And they're an incredible, poetry house. They focus on poetry, but also on translations of foreign literature into language, or into English language, excuse me. And that is something that really, I feel like, if you're looking for something poetic and inspiring and interesting, all of their authors are amazing. But my book, Meditations on Being, is going to be coming out on November 3rd, so Election Day. I didn't pick it. They picked it.
I was like, wow.
You need to calm down on Election Day. Please, please. You can get it on Amazon right now. You can get it on deepvellum.org. They are a nonprofit, which is amazing. They support North Texas literary artists as well. And actually, now that I have you here,
Okay.
if there are any listeners who work in a corporate context and they're looking to sponsor an audiobook, that is what Deep Vellum is looking for, is any, especially, it's kind of, for them, it's about disability. So people who don't have the ability to read, right? Or that might not have, access to books, or, a context in which they can use a book. Dyslexia is a big thing that we're working with and around. So audiobooks are a format that give more people more access to more literature. And so they are looking for sponsors and friends who are interested in bringing some audiobooks to fruition from their current titles. So please reach out to me, and you can reach out to Deep Vellum. You can find me on Instagram at Rachel Ruth Fox. That's the best way to get a hold of me. Just period. The end is on Instagram.
Find her on Instagram. We got it.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. You are such a ray of light. Thank you for your work. Thank you. Thank you for spending this time, and thank you for being flexible with my crazy schedule and things moving around. But I think the timing was perfect as it turned out. So please let me know if there's anything that we can do from a 2020 Lives Change perspective. I will definitely put information out on LinkedIn for our network so that we can see if we can get some corporate sponsors for you guys and for Deep Vellum Books.
And Sherry, you are a ray of light. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and the being on this program is a gift. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, I will see you again very soon. So I will invite you to more of our events, and hopefully at some point I will actually get to meet you and then give you a hug once we get done with the the isolation. I'm over it. So thank you so much, Rachel. We will have this available on Instagram probably by tomorrow. So I'm very excited to hear feedback from your fans and your listeners. And if there's anything else that we can do for you, just let us know.
Thank you so much. I will see everybody there. If they want daily poems, that's where they are, Instagram. So we'll all meet there.
And they're awesome because they've been working for me this last week. So know that the poems are awesome. Awesome. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Rachel.